jet pumps have been around for a long time. I've got a title here, a look at one of the original pumps. Back in 1934 is when Stay-Right started, and that's about the time everybody was making electric motor jet pumps. So that's kind of what we started with. Now you got to remember, a jet pump is actually two pumps. It is part of a centrifugal pump. It is a self-priming centrifugal pump. As a self-priming centrifugal pump, it's got an impeller in it. The impeller has an eye. Remember, the entrance to the impeller is the eye of the impeller. That's where the water is going to it. The purpose of the impeller is to speed up the water, and it uses the impeller vane to do that. And then there is an impeller passage. The passage is the area between the vanes. That's how we're going to speed up the water. We're going to catch the water at the eye with the vane, and then push it out towards the peripheral. Okay? The impeller port, which is formed by the front and back shrouds, the impeller port is what really determines the flow rate. Each impeller has a peripheral, and that peripheral is based on the circumference there. So, of course, the larger the circumference, the larger the impeller diameter is, then the more water we're going to get, because speed is tied to two things. It's tied to impeller diameter, and it's also tied to RPMs. There does come a point where, at the RPMs that we're spinning it, and the diameter of the impeller, you can only get so much water through the port, though, and that's why I say the port is what really determines the flow rate. If you change something, then you can, if you change something, then you can get more water through it. So if I change my speed by changing my diameter or by changing my RPMs, then the port's going to react and let more or less water go through, depending on how I change it. All right? So it is the speed of the water that at the impeller peripheral that determines the flow and pressure. Now, therefore, the faster the water moves, the more water I'll get. So the larger the impeller diameter, the more water I get. However, and this is important, the deeper I have to go to get the water, the more difficult it is to bring the water up. So keeping the pump closer to the water vertically will help me get more water. All right, we've got to remember, too, that friction loss is also going to get added to that vertical lift, so making sure we've got the right size suction pipe on there is also another huge improvement in flow. So if you're looking for water, get that pump as close to the water vertically as possible and get the suction pipe a reasonable size. The suction hole in the pump is not necessarily the size of the pipe that you should be using. Everybody understands that? All right. The theoretical static lift of a centrifugal pump at sea level, and I know some of you are at sea level, but some of you aren't, is 34 feet. And the way that you come about that, there's 14.7 psi pushing down at you at sea level, and it's 2.31 feet of head per pound of pressure. So if you take 14.7 times 2.31, you come up with 33.9. We rounded it off to 34 feet. So you can lift water theoretically 34 feet. Of course, in real life, you're not going to be able to do that. Okay? So most conservative engineers are going to give you a 9-foot safety factor. If you subtract 9 from 34, most conservative engineers are going to tell you that the practical lift of a centrifugal pump at sea level is 25 feet. 25 feet. And that's what most people will tell you is the practical lift. All right? This is important because when it comes to jet pumps, 25 feet is the max when you're talking a shallow well jet. Okay? So let's talk about pumps here, because remember, jet pumps are really two pumps in one. They are a self-priming centrifugal pump, but they also have a jet. All right? The jet is a pump all by itself. And if you look at the picture here, you'll notice we've got 3 jets. They're all the same. Some things have changed about them, though. If you look at the jet way over on the left-hand side there, you're going to see each of them has a nozzle, each of them has a venturi tube, and each of them have a body. But the one on the left-hand side has the suction hole on the top and the drive hole on the bottom. The one in the middle has the drive hole on the top and the suction hole on the bottom. The middle configuration is the one that is industry standard. The one on the left-hand side was a stay-right standard until about 15 years ago, when we switched from the from the A and B series pumps to our H and S series pumps. Okay. You'll notice the two, the one in the middle and the one on the left-hand side there, are shallow well configurations, which means you're going to bolt that jet right to the pump. All right, you can see the bolts in the middle one there, and the gasket there. You're going to bolt that right to the front of the pump. That makes it shallow well. Remember, shallow well is only good to 25 feet. You'll notice if you look on the one on the right-hand side there, that's in the vertical position. You still have your drive and suction hole. You'll notice that the nozzle goes in the suction hole. The venturi tube goes on top of the nozzle. Now, it doesn't fit right smack on top of it, but there's pretty close to it, okay? This is the deep well configuration. Another very important point that I like to make when I'm showing this particular slide is that when you are talking a shallow well application, notice the end of the venturi tube. It is totally round. That's because when you put the jet package and bolt it to the pump, that venturi tube is going to push against the diffuser ring, and that's what's going to seal the suction side of the pump from the discharge side of the pump. And that's why it's important that you note that one's got to be perfectly round. If you look at the one on the vertical there, you're going to notice that's got a little groove, couple of grooves in it. There's a special tool that we use here at the factory, and when the guy making the jet packages up puts that venturi tube in there, he starts it, and then he takes his special air tool and goes zip, and that's going to torque it down to a certain torque. So that way they all go out of here at the same torque. And so that's what that little two little things are for, because you're not connecting that to anything. The suction hole, there's going to be a pipe that attaches to that suction hole. It's going to go right over the top of that venturi tube, and you don't have a diffuser ring now, so you don't have to worry about sealing that area off. All right? The other thing I want to point out, there was a guy one time who purchased the deep well adapter. And of course, if you purchase a deep well jet, again, you'll notice the suction, or the venturi tube, the end of the venturi tube is much different from the end of the venturi tube on the shallow well jets. So he said to me, can I just cut it? And he wanted to cut it where that red line is, and then go ahead and use it as a shallow well jet. Of course, I'm sure you all know the answer to that is, no, you can't. Okay? Couple reasons why you can't. First of all, if you cut it too short, you've ruined it anyway. And second of all, if you don't cut it perfectly horizontal, when you go to put it in there, it might not seal against that diffuser ring, all right? And the third and probably most important reason why you can't cut it is because if you were to cut that long venturi tube, it would not react the same as those venturi tubes used for the shallow well jets. In other words, there's from the base where it screws in over the top of the nozzle to the end of it, that is a conical shape, and it gets a little wider as it gets towards that exit. And the bottom line is, if you cut it, you're changing the shape of the tube, and that's going to change how the water reacts in there, and so you probably won't get what you want out of it. Now, again, this is going to become very important because when you're putting when you are going to buy a convertible pump and you're going to attach a jet to that pump, that's gonna make a difference that you get the right jet in there, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about here. Remember I said about 15 years ago we changed our pump model numbers and we went from an A and a B to H and S. All right, now I want you to know the S is equivalent to the A series pump that we use, and the BB series is equivalent to our new H series now, okay? The H series stands for high service factor motor. The BB series was a high service factor motor, all right? The S series stands for a standard service factor motor. Now, what exactly does that mean? If you increase the service factor of the motor, you decrease the horsepower this gives you, and that makes the H series pump. So in other words, what happened was down in Florida, which happened till probably, about 10 years or so, Florida used to be the biggest user of pumps. And so when they said this something, you kind of listened to them. What we did was said, we've got a half horsepower pump that will do the same thing as their 3/4 horsepower pump. Well, of course, what made the half horsepower pump a half horsepower pump? The service factor. So when we buy a motor, that motor has a certain maximum horsepower to it. We can change the label on that motor as long as the service factor is 1 or more. So when we raise the service factor of the motor, that's going to lower the horsepower, and now I can say I've got a half horsepower motor that does the same as their 3/4 horse. It's really a 3/4 horse, trust me, okay? So if you leave that service factor alone, it's going to give you the S series pump. The standard service factor when it comes to jet pumps is right around 1.2, 1.25, somewhere in there. When you get into pumps, standard centrifugal pumps, and you get 3 horse or larger, now your service factor goes to about 1.15. But when you get into jet pumps, things are a little different. So, and as you change the service factor, you're changing the horsepower on the pump. So let's take a look at how service factor affects our pump and motors. What I've done here is I've gone onto the cell sheets and I've cut out just the piece that we need, which is the performance piece, okay? You'll notice that the catalog numbers are over there. This is the S series pump. This is the H series pump. If you look carefully at them, you'll see the biggest difference between them, because they are the same pump essentially, is that the S series pump does not have a spot to put the pressure gauge. If you look at the H series pump, you can see in the very top of the pump, there's a pipe plug there. That pipe plug, so you can take that out and you can put a pressure gauge in that area. The other difference is the switch that's being used. While they both use a square D switch, one square D switch is not the same as the other. One square D switch will just have the one main screw in there where you can raise and lower your pressure. The other square D switch, the more expensive square D switch, is going to have 2 of those screws in there. One raises and lowers the pressure, the other one just raises the off pressure or lowers the off pressure. So the H series is going to use the more expensive pump, the S series is not. So that's what they look like, and you can see they're pretty darn close to the exact same pump. Now let's look at performances here, all right? There's your HN series or your H series, here's your S series. We're using the N, HN and SN, so we're comparing the same thing here. The N stands for designated shallow well. So these are designated shallow well pumps, and the pictures we saw a little bit ago were designated shallow well pumps, all right? We're going to get rid of that. We're going to look just at the HNC, and we're going to compare that to the SND. Remember, if you raise your service factor, you lower the horsepower. So the HN is a half horse, the SN is a 3/4 horse. But I want you to notice, if you look at 5 foot to water, and you'll notice each of them has 3 discharge pressures, 30, 40, and 50. And when you look at the performances of both pumps, you'll notice they're identical. 15 at 30, 12.5 at 40, 8 at 50. Okay? If you look at the shutoff pressures, you'll see the shutoff pressures are identical. All right? Now let's get rid of that. We're going to look at specifics here. Most pump companies, when they talk about jet pumps, they give you a performance chart that bases everything on 40 psi. So 5 foot to water, 40 psi, 12.5 gallons. Now, what we're going to note here, and it goes back to the slides a couple slides ago, where we said that the deeper you go to water, so at 15 feet, I'm only getting 10.1 with the same pump. 25 feet, which is about the maximum lift, is going to be 6.8. Now, you'll notice that I did say it's about the maximum lift, because most engineers are going to tell you a centrifugal pump is 25-foot lift, a jet pump is definitely 25-foot lift at sea level. All right? Then I'm going to tell you, if you're using plastic pipe on the suction side, and if you've got a high-pressure day, you might a little more. So you might be able to go just a little bit deeper than that 25 feet, but we're only going to give you a charge of 25 because we figure that's about the max that you can go. So we're going to switch here, and once again, now I'm showing you the difference between the convertible pump and the designated shallow well pump. And you'll see if you look carefully there, the convertible pump has the 2 holes in the front of it. Suction hole on top, drive hole in the bottom. Remember, the old A series and BB series were the opposite. For those of you that do use the HMS series, that's a horizontal multi-stage. We'll take a look a little different here. That still uses the old stay-right connection. All right, so that still has the drive over suction. But all of our newer pumps now, they've got this new configuration of suction over drive. If you were to take that designated shallow well pump apart, it would have the 2 parts too. So you would have a drive and you would have a suction there. Let's take a look. All right. So if you look here, the light blue area, that's the discharge side of the pump. The dark blue area is the suction side of the pump. Now, basically, how the pump works is this. You'll notice there is a nozzle. The nozzle has an entrance. The entrance is in the discharge side. So you're going to push high pressure water through a large hole. Then you're going to bring it out on the discharge side of the nozzle, and you'll notice that it gets smaller. It's conical in shape. And so as you force the water through that cone, it's like putting your thumb over the end of the hole in a hose. And what winds up when you put your thumb over the end of the hole in the hose is you wind up having some high pressure water on one side, which would be the discharge side, and you have some high velocity water on the exit. So basically what we're going to do here, we've got something that we call a mixing chamber. The mixing chamber. And what happens is we've got high velocity water coming out of the nozzle into the mixing chamber, and we've got pressure that's pushing the suction water in. And that's because as the velocity goes up, the pressure goes down. So the pressure in the mixing chamber goes down, and here's our first pump. All right? Now what winds up happening is we send that water through the hole there in the Venturi tube, and we take that water that we've mixed and we run it into the eye of the impeller, our second pump. So our first pump is a jet. It's a pump all by itself. There's no moving parts. We just use high pressure water to make the jet work. we get that high pressure water from our discharge side. So basically, it's a booster pump. And what we're doing is we're pushing the water through the jet, one pump, into the self-priming pump, the eye of the impeller, and we're going to increase the speed. We'll use the diffuser to take that speeded water and change it from speed to pressure, and then of course what happens? Some of that water is going to go out the discharge, some of that water is going to go back, recirculate, and go through the nozzle and venturi again. Because of this, what winds up happening is you wind up with a higher pressure but a lower flow. So when you're operating a jet pump, it's like a booster pump, except because you're using flow to boost that pressure up, you're losing some of your flow and gaining pressure. You get more pressure out of it. Now, when you hook up your shallow well jet pump, and these pictures were taken out of the owner's manual, you'll notice that they're not to scale, and you can see there's two different ways of hooking them up. There's something called a driven point installation, and then there is the cased well installation. We're going to talk about the driven point installation first. The driven point has exactly that. It's got a stainless steel screen that has a stainless steel point on the end of it. Basically what you're going to do, you've got a drive coupling there, you're going to take a hammer and you're going to just pound it down in the ground. Now, of course, by itself, the screen's not going to be in the water, so you're going to have to attach another piece of pipe, another drive coupling, and drive it down further. All right? The important thing that we're trying to point out here is that once you get it down in the water, the driven point has to be below the water line. If the screen is above the water line, you will pull air in, and you may not even be able to get the pump to prime. So that whole screen has to be down under the water level. And of course, remember, when we talk water level, we're talking pump language now, when we talk water level, we're talking the drawdown level of the well. So the driven point has to be below the drawdown level of the well. All right? The other thing that's really different about this one is you have to put a check valve above the well. So someplace between, because they don't want you to put the check valve down in the dirt. So someplace between the wellhead and the pump, you're going to have to put a check valve. We recommend getting that check valve out as close to the well as possible. All right? The reason for it is the area from the check valve to the surface of the water is air. And of course, all that air has to be evacuated before you get the pump to prime. So this is why you want to keep that area as small as possible so it makes it easier for the pump to prime. Speaking of priming the pump, a couple things you can. Now, you don't have to do this, but if you want to, you can put a T on the top of that well. By putting a T on top of that well, you put a pipe plug on the top of that T. That gives you a plate that you can prime. Now, of course, you can also prime through the top of the pump. So it's up to you how you want to prime it. You can prime in both spots. You can only prime in one spot. It's totally up to you. The point being, though, is that the prime is only going to go to that check valve. From the check valve to the surface of the water, okay, that's all going to be air. You just have to remember that, okay? It's got to be evacuated, and this is why we use a self-priming pump, so we can evacuate that water, all right? Now, if we get rid of that one, we look at the other one here. This is where our cased well is we're going to drill a well and then case it. Now, because we're drilling a well and casing it, what that means is we now want to make sure that we've got some distance here. I'm going to tell you what we recommend, and I'm going to tell you that not everybody does it, okay? We're going to recommend that 10-foot level there, that you get the foot valve down at the 10-foot level. By putting a foot valve in, one of the things that happens now, you see the priming tee up there on top? Now the water will fill up that whole pipe all the way down to the foot valve. Of course, you've also got your priming tee up on top. Don't forget you need a sanitary seal on that, okay? And then when you get all that put together, what winds up happening is now you've got the whole system primed. So because there's water all the way down to the foot valve, and the foot valve is at the bottom of the well, not right on the bottom, but towards the bottom of the well, it's well under the water, what that means is when you turn the system on, you should not have any problem priming whatsoever. Of course, remember, once again, we are talking a shallow well application, and you're measuring from the pump to the surface of the water when we talk shallow well. And you saw earlier when we looked at that depth of water that the deeper you have to go, the less water you're going to get, because it's harder to get that water up there, okay? So keep those thoughts in mind when you are thinking about putting in this pump. Don't forget you can prime it at the top there too, all right? Now, if you're using a deep well application, remember what you're doing here now, you are going to put a jet down in the well, all right? It's going to be vertical, and of course you're going to have to hook up both pipes. You can see the suction pipe is over the top of the venturi tube, the drive pipe hooks up there. Notice there's the chamber where the drive pipe is going to bring the water down, force it through the nozzle area, and then as the water comes up out of that nozzle area, it's going to increase in velocity. That increase in velocity will draw up on the foot valve and allow the well water to mix, and that's why we call that the mixing chamber. Once it's all mixed, now what's going to happen, that water is going to be forced up through the venturi tube. The venturi tube will slow it down and convert that high velocity water into high pressure water. And of course, that's now going to allow you to push the water up to the pump. If you're using a single stage, notice how I'm putting this. If you're using a single stage jet pump here, you've got your single stage self-priming pump on top and your jet down the well. Depending on your horsepower, you're looking at a maximum depth of somewhere around 100 to 120 feet. And again, that depends on your horsepower. Your smaller horsepower pumps are not going to go that far, but you get up into the higher horsepower pumps, they'll make it down that deep. Higher horsepower for a jet pump is going to be somewhere around, a single stage jet pump, be somewhere around 1 to 1.5 horsepower, depending on whether you're using the H series or the S series. Remember, the 1 horse H is the same as the 1.5 horse S. Okay? When you're looking at your deep well application, once again, there are 2 types of wells you can use. And you can see they're going to hook up the same but differently. Now, what I mean by the same, the hookup coming out of the pump is the same. There's going to be 2 pipes going out to the well. What happens, though, is when you go with a 2 or 3 inch well, you're going to have to use a special well adapter. If you look at the well adapter here, you're going to notice that it has suction overdrive. In our well, we're going to put a jet. Now, this is called a single pipe jet. You'll notice that it's threaded right above the entrance, so that way we can bring a pipe down over the top of it. And you'll also notice down there in the bottom in that red box, those 2 things are called leathers, cup leathers. What happens is the cup leathers swell up and they seal the well. So that way, the bottom of the well can be at atmospheric pressure. Anything above those leathers will be at the pressure of the water coming down. Okay? Now, it does take a certain amount of pressure to make this whole system work properly. So, if your 2-inch well or your 3-inch well has a hole in it, the likelihood is you're not going to be able to use this jet. because you've got to keep a certain amount of pressure on there, back pressure on that jet, to make sure that you get the velocity of the water moving through the venturi or the nozzle, so you can get that suction. If you don't have the correct amount of water going through the nozzle, you can't get the velocity you need, therefore you're not going to get the suction you need. You won't be able to prime that thing. Okay? The other thing you're going to notice here, as I mentioned, this is suction over drive. So you're going to pump the water into the drive hole, and it's going to go down along the outside of the suction pipe and into that suction hole there. Okay? So that drive water goes into that hole. The top of that hole is open to the bottom of the nozzle, which remember is the bigger area now. So the high pressure water goes up into the bottom of the nozzle, and then of course as we force it out of the water, out of the nozzle, it turns into high velocity water, and that's our first pump. There is a mixing chamber there, the same as there is in the other jets, and that water is going to mix and get pushed up through, and so you draw a suction on it and push the water up to the pump. So what happens here is you wind up with water going up to the pump. Now that was a single pipe, what they call a single pipe jet. This is called a double pipe system. In a double pipe system, you're going to have your drive water come down. Remember, it's going to be connected all the way up to the pump, and then you'll notice you can see the venturi tube sticking there. The suction pipe is going to go over the top of the venturi tube. All right? Once again, water is going to come down the drive pipe, make that corner, and go up through the bottom of the nozzle. All right? Suction water is going to get pulled in. It's going to go through the mixing chamber there, and then up through the venturi tube. And as it goes up through the venturi tube, you're going to increase the pressure, and so you've got one pump feeding another pump. And that's why I say when you've got a jet, it's virtually no moving parts. So we're going to send water down the drive pipe and bring it back up through the suction pipe. And yes, you can see that picture is a picture of an older stay-right pump. Okay? Because the older pumps were drive-over suction, there is a package out there called a package 108. And what it is a reversing adapter. So if you've got an old stay-right pump, you can just go ahead, the jet's down, the well and everything, you can go ahead and change the pump out. You can put the new H or S series pump on there. Remember, it's not by horsepower, it's by a combination of the nozzle and venturi tube, and we're going to talk about those in just a second, that you're going to buy that jet. And so if you've got a jet down the well and the jet's working fine, the pump just needs to be replaced, put a reversing adapter on it. Then you can go down the well one way and into the pump the other way. All right? Now, speaking of those deep well jets, we are now looking at the H-series pump. L means convertible. Remember we saw that picture of the convertible pump. It had two holes coming out of the front of it. L means convertible. N means designated shallow well. L means convertible. So we're looking at our HL series pumps here. We specifically picked the half horse, the HLC. You'll notice there are jet packages here. And there's 4 different jet packages that will work with this particular pump. All right? If you look at those jet packages, you're going to notice that different depths to water. No, I did not cut it off. 120 feet is the max. And you can see the half horsepower pump, no matter what jet you put on it, is not going to get 120 feet. If you use the CK3, 40 feet is the maximum. The 54SD, 70 feet is the maximum. The CK5, 50 feet is the maximum. And the 55SD, 90 feet is the maximum. And once again, you'll notice that the deeper you go, the less water you get. And this is why it's important that we offer you these different jets and that you know how deep it is to water. Remember, when we talk depth to water, we're talking the drawdown level. Now, you'll notice here, this is the SD package. There were two packages there, a 54 SD and a 55 SD. This is an SD package. An SD package is going to come with a Venturi tube and a nozzle and a body. That's all it has. One Venturi tube, one nozzle, one body. You'll notice down there on the bottom it says it can work as a shallow well pump, and you can buy it as a deep well pump. So remember, you're only getting one nozzle. If the nozzle you're purchasing is for deep well, it's going to be a deep well nozzle. If the jet that you're buying is a shallow well jet, it's going to be a shallow well nozzle. I mean a Venturi tube. I'm saying that wrong, sorry. It's going to be a shallow well Venturi tube. And so remember the differences in those two tubes. The deep well tube is longer and has a couple of little cuts in the top of it for us to use our special tool with. The shallow well does not. It's all round. So make sure when you're ordering one of these jets that you're ordering the right one when it comes to, am I putting it in deep well or am I putting it in shallow well? The 54 SD and the 55 SD are designed for deep well application only. So when it says shallow well and deep well, remember, you're buying it for shallow well or you're buying it for deep well. Okay? The next package we want to look at is the CK package. When you look at the CK package, it is very important. The CK package was named after the engineer who actually designed the CK package. His name was Corey Coles, hence the name CK. He wanted to make sure we wouldn't forget him. When Corey designed this package, what he did was he started looking at the nozzle and Venturi combinations. And what you're going to notice here is that it gives you a Venturi tube to use. This is only important if you're looking at a CK package. So the CK3 is going to use the J32P26. The CK5 is going to use the N32P-66B. All right? When you look up there at that package, you'll see there are going to be multiple Venturi tubes that come with it, and there'll also be one Venturi tube in the jet. The Venturi tube in the jet may not be the correct Venturi tube. So anytime that you buy a CK package, make sure before you put it down the well, and you got to make sure that your installers know this because you're not putting it down the well. If there are any installers on, make sure you pay attention to this, okay? Make sure that you've got the right Venturi tube in there before you put it down the well, all right? You'll notice it does say nozzle, and it gives you a nozzle number for each of those packages, but when you look at the package, there is no nozzle shown there because that nozzle is underneath the Venturi tube that's already in the jet, and there is only one nozzle. And that's what Corey realized is this nozzle works with this Venturi tube and this Venturi tube and this Venturi tube and this Venturi tube. But it gives you a different flow rate out of each Venturi tube, and some of those Venturi tubes, as you can see, are shallow well, and some of those Venturi tubes, as you can see, are deep well. Now, one more thing I want to show you before we move on here. We're going to use the CK3 package. Don't forget, anytime you use a CK3 package, to make sure you've got the right Venturi tube in there. With the right Venturi tube, at 20 feet to water, I can get 9.4 gallons with this particular jet. You'll notice the jets are listed there as flow rate at 20 feet, higher to lower. Okay? So this one's going to give me the most water. Of course, you'll also notice at 30 feet I drop down to 8 gallons. At 40 feet I drop down to 6 gallons. What happens at 50 feet? At 50 feet, I lose prime. Okay? The force of the water going through the jet is not enough to create the suction I need, and so I lose prime. Okay? Unless. All right, here's the unless. Tailpipes are used on double pipe systems only. So if I've got a double pipe system, now remember a double pipe system is a closed loop, the jet's in the very bottom of it there, okay? So because it is a closed loop, I can use it in a 4-inch well, a 6-inch well, an 8-inch well, a lake, a pond, a dug well. As long as it's bigger than 4 inches and I can fit it in there, I can use a double pipe system. So I put my double pipe system down into the well here, and then you're going to notice that there is a water table. All right? Once the water table gets to a certain point, the jet's going to lose prime. Unless I put a 35-foot tailpipe on there. Now, it has to be 35 feet for a reason, and the reason simply is this. 35 feet is going to be an atmosphere, a little more than an atmosphere. And so what that does is that allows me to draw water up from a deeper depth. It adds one more atmosphere. Now, of course, there is a cost to everything. Nothing is free. Typically at 50 feet, when your water table drops, typically when you get to 50 feet, at 40 feet you're getting 6.6 gallons. At 50 feet, you're out of water, unless you're using a jet or a tailpipe. If you're using a tailpipe, now you're going to get 80% of that 6.6 gallons, which is 5 1/4 gallons. So even though typically you would have lost prime, because you've got a tailpipe on here, now you can still get 5 1/4 gallons. At 15 feet below the jet, which would be 55 feet, again, typically you're out of water, but with a jet, with a tailpipe on my jet, I'm still getting 70%. 70% of 6.6 is a little over 4 1/2 gallons. At 20 feet, I'm definitely out of water, unless I got the tailpipe on there, and I'm still getting 57%, which is 3 3/4 gallons. At 25 feet, so now we're at 65 feet to water. We're at 2.64 gallons. At 69 feet, which would be the maximum that you can get, you're at 1.12 gallons. So you can see that putting a tailpipe on there is going to help you to get water if you're in an application where the water table drops. Say, for example, you're in a place where in the summertime, as it gets hot, people start using water and the water table goes down. As long as the water table doesn't go down more than about 30 feet and you've got a jet pump, you can still get that jet pump to work. Remember what the key is. It's got to be some kind of a drilled or dug well. It's got to be able to put a 35-foot length of pipe on the end of it. If you do that, two things are going to happen. One, you will never lose prime. Because the pipe is 35 foot long, as long as it's sealed all the way down to that foot valve in the very bottom of it there, you will never lose prime. Because the atmosphere can't go down deep enough, and so therefore you'll always have prime in that pump. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you can't hurt the pump. Because remember, if I don't have enough water flowing through the pump, I get hot water cavitation after about 20 minutes. So you want to protect yourself against that. So you'll never lose prime, and you'll always get some kind of a flow. What goes in is going to come out. Of course, there does come a point where I can't get enough to go in, I won't get anything out. That's hot water cavitation. Any questions about a tailpipe?
This is Ryan. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
The chart that you showed before this slide here gave those gallons per minute and heads at what was it, 40 psi? I think you were.
Yeah.
The chart said.
Yeah.
Is that the minimum pressure that these pumps can have, or is that, can you go down to 30 and have it perform differently?
You can go down to 30. The reason that we use 40 is because, generally speaking, when you are sizing a pump, you want to use the mean pressure. Most jet pumps have a 30-50 pressure switch on them, and so the mean pressure is 40 psi. So most pump companies, and I'm not just talking about Pentair, I'm talking most pump companies, are going to give you a chart at 40 psi. Now you kind of have to watch it, because every once in a while someone will try and slip one in on you, and they'll give you flow rates at 30 psi. So if they're giving you flow rates at 30 psi, you're going to get more water because you got less pressure. So make sure that they're all holding to the standard, but the standard tends to be 40 psi, and that was a very good question, Brian. Thank you for that. All right. Anybody else have a question?
I just want to say that I know on this tailpipe issue, that is a great thing to know and use. You know, a lot of people don't know about if you put that long tailpipe on there, you won't lose prime, and you'll always it'll keep the level constant, you know, as you go, and it's a big deal.
Yeah, I agree with you. Again, the only caution or red flag that I throw up with the tailpipe is make sure that you've got something on that pump to protect it from hot water cavitation. Because what can happen is if the water flow slows down enough and you're not getting enough water to go through the pump, it will start to heat the water up and you'll wind up melting your impeller and diffuser. Rainbird makes a temperature gauge that fits right on the suction or fits right on the pump. So you glue it to the body of the pump and you run your electric through it. And basically it's an overload protector, and when the overload protector trips, it turns off electricity to the pump. So that's one way you can do it. Another way you can do it, and of course you've got to be a little more careful with this, we make something called an SPP, single phase protection. With single phase protection, what you do is you turn the pump on and you have to calibrate what's going to happen. And basically what's going to happen is this: you're going to turn it on, you're going to calibrate the flow rate. When you get within 80% of that flow rate, you drop down below 80% of that flow rate, it turns the pump off. So it's another way of just protecting the pump. It probably won't let you get down as far as the tailpipe would allow, but it at least would protect your pump so you wouldn't burn up. But thank you for that comment. That was a very good point. Okay, priming the pump. And of course, we're using a deep well jet here now, remember. So when you prime the deep well jet, notice there are two chambers here. This is the big chamber, and if you look way over on the left-hand side of the pump, there is the pressure gauge, and it is attached to the big chamber. You'll see why that's important in a second. There's our pressure gauge. Then you go over to here, and you've got your smaller chamber. Now, right there in the smaller chamber, there's two holes. One's in the bottom part of the smaller chamber, the other one's in the top part of the chamber, and of course the one in the top is threaded, and you put in something called a pressure regulator. A pressure regulator. Now the pressure regulator has a straight little piece of plastic coming down with a little cap on the bottom of it, so that when you screw it all the way down, it will plug the hole. And of course, what you're going to want to do when you very first prime the pump, though, is you want to make sure that you open it all the way up. So you unscrew that pressure regulator all the way, and then you can prime the pump. And you can see the water's going to go right through the whole pump. It will go all the way down, but again, if you want to, you can put a priming plug at the well too, if you want to. Either way. The point is you've got to prime it all the way down to the very bottom of the jet. And so it's not going to take just a gallon of water because you've got a lot of pipe there. Okay? The other things in that small chamber, besides your discharge hole and your pressure regulator, is the tube that connects to the pressure switch. This is how you turn the pump on and off. Now remember, it's connected to the small chamber, not the big chamber, and again, you'll see why that's important in a second here. All right? So, once I've got the whole pump primed, there's water coming out of the priming hole at the top there, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the pressure regulator down all the way. That's going to plug that hole. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn the pump on. When I turn the pump on, water's going to go down the suction, or down the drive pipe and up the suction pipe. As it does that, you're going to get the maximum pressure that that pump can build at that depth to water. That's a key factor there, okay? Because remember, the deeper the water is, the less pressure you get. So you need to know to make sure that your pressure switch will turn off, all right? The next thing that's going to happen is you're going to start to open up that regulator. As you open up the regulator, the pressure gauge will start to wiggle back and forth. What's causing the wiggling back and forth is as the water is being forced down the dry pipe and comes back up the suction pipe, basically what's happening is it's high velocity water, and it's going to knock off any bubbles. If you've ever filled up a glass with water and you notice that bubbles cling to the side of the glass, that's what happens when you're going to put this, fill this pump up with water and prime it. That's what's going to happen. So what you're going to do is you're going to knock all those bubbles off. Once those bubbles have cleared, and by the way, when they come out kind of milky, so you wind up with a little bit of what looks like milk coming out of the pump, it will clear out because it's just bubbles that you've chopped up in little bitty bubbles, okay? And once those bubbles have cleared the pump, now what happens is your pressure gauge steadies out. Once the pressure gauge steadies out, now I'm going to close it 1/4 of a turn, and that will set it for my depth to water. Remember, as long as my depth to water does not change drastically, the system will stay primed. Everything will work just fine. All right? Now, again, what we've been talking about here are single-stage pumps. Because now we're going to talk about multi-stage jet pumps. There are two types of multi-stage jet pumps that we have here. If you look on the left side of your screen there, that is a HMS, horizontal multi-stage. Remember what I said about it. It still has the old connection. So if you look at that connection, you've got drive over suction instead of suction over drive. Okay? The other multi-stage pump that we use is the vertical. So it is called an MS series pump. All right? And it's a vertical multi-stage pump. You'll notice if you look at the side of the vertical multi-stage that there is a pressure regulator there. Okay? When you look at the pressure regulator, I'm going to break it down so you see all the different parts to it. We start out, you saw the pressure gauge on top of it. All right? There's going to be a body and there's going to be a bonnet. All right? Between the body and the bonnet, there's a thick rubber diaphragm. All right? There's going to be some cap screws that are going to hold that bonnet to the body. There's a stem assembly underneath the diaphragm. There's a valve seat and a regulator guide. Those are the parts that are in there underneath. Okay? Now, the point is this. On top of it, you've got a spring. All right? Now, there's some parts that aren't labeled. Okay? The spring is going to be have a little piece on top of it. That little piece is there so that you can adjust the adjusting screw, and that compresses or decompresses the spring. On the bottom of the spring, there's another little steel piece, and the regulator guide is going to screw up into that. You can see on the very end of the regulator guide, there is a screw that screws up into that little metal piece. So that all hooks together, so now you can open and close and adjust that regulator guide sliding into the stem assembly. Okay? So as you compress the spring all the way, in other words, you screw that bolt there all the way down, that's going to compress the spring and shut off any flow going out of the pump, and that's, again, how you're going to prime it. Okay? You'll take the pressure gauge off, and you can prime it right through the hole the pressure gauge is on. One more thing I want to point out, when you're looking at that adjustment screw, you'll notice there's a nut on there. The nut is there for a very important reason. Once I get the adjustment screw set to where I want, I bring that nut down tight on top of that bonnet, and that adjustment screw can't turn. If I don't do that, the vibration of the water moving through there and hitting that diaphragm and bouncing on that spring will cause the adjustment screw to turn. So to prevent it from turning, make sure you tighten that nut up. All right? So when I tighten the nut, or when I tighten the adjustment screw all the way down, you can see here what happens. I close off the flow of water. You'll notice there that the tube going to the pressure switch is on the discharge side of the regulator. And so what that means is when I close this off, no water is going to get to that pressure switch, and that pressure switch is never going to turn it off. Then what I do once I get it primed, I start opening up that adjustment screw, and as I open up the adjustment screw, now water will flow through and go to the pressure switch so the pump can turn off. I want to point out one more thing for you here. This comes out of the owner's manual. It's how to prime the pump. But the most important thing that's going to help you, because they don't tell you this in the owner's manual, so I'm going to tell you this, okay? Right there is a drain plug. All right? Right there is the drain plug. I take that off, water drains out of the pump. So in the wintertime, when I want to drain my pump, that's what I'm going to do. But when I want to prime my pump, two things you can do. This is called, and it's probably best not to use this directly. What you want to do is you want to put a little drain cap on there first. So you put the little drain port on there first. You're going to screw that in. It's called a drain cock, and it's got a little piece that you can open up and close. This will screw into that. All right. And then what's going to happen is you're going to put a piece of tubing over this thing, and when you put a piece of tubing over this thing, now you take the piece of tubing, after you fill the pump up with water, now you go ahead and you take the tubing, fill the bucket up with water again, set it right next to the pump, put the tubing in there also. Make sure that you've got water flowing through the tubing. Okay? When you do that, now you go to turn the pump on. Vertical pumps are a little more difficult to prime simply because they're vertical. So what winds up happening, those air bubbles come up and you can lose prime. If you've got that tube connected there, now you're going to get the prime to take. All right? One more thing I want to show you. This is a letter that we received from a guy, and we didn't understand his original letter, so we said, can you send us some photos? And so he did. He enclosed some photos, and you can see a picture of his hookup here. Okay? The point that I want to make here is that paragraph says, I wanted a packer well. Now, I want to make sure you understand what a packer well means. A packer well means we're going to put a 2 or 3 inch jet down in the hole. So I've got a 2-inch well or a 3-inch well. I want to use a packer down in that hole, and they call that 2-inch jet a packer. All right? Now notice here he says that would have lines 3 and line 5 going directly into the pump without an ejector. It's very important that you note the point that he says without an ejector, because if you look at the picture, you'll notice he's got an ejector on the pump. I'm not quite sure why he wanted to do it that way, but that's what he decided to do. Then he points out that number 1, he's actually got 2 wells here. So 3 and 5 go down to the deep well. Number 1 is a shallow well. Number 1 is a shallow well. So number 1 connects to his old well, which is a shallow well. Number 2 is a shutoff from that shallow well. So if I don't want to use the water out of the shallow well, I just want to use the deep well, I close that valve, and now I'm just using the shallow well. And of course, this problem here is he's not getting enough water out of the shallow well, so that's why he wants to put his deep well in there. Okay? So remember, no ejector. All right? So here we go. Number 4. And I want you to notice what he says is the water coming up from the well, that is from the old well, assuming number 2 is open. Okay? Of course, the bottom line is, if you look at number 4, it's the discharge of the pump. It doesn't care whether it's getting water from the old well or the new well. All right? He's got a 4-way on top of it. All right? The 4-way connects to the discharge. The 4-way connects to the tank. The 4-way connects to the spigot. And the 4-way connects to a pipe. All right? That pipe becomes number 5. And notice number 5 does 2 things. It goes out to the garden. All right? And it goes down and becomes the drive water. Okay? Number 6 is the shutoff line so we can turn the drive water off. Now, here's his complaint. When I shut off the valve to number 2, I do not get any water from the new well. No water is going down the drive line. Who can tell me why not? The reason that we're not getting water out of it is really quite simple. Remember what I talked about when I said to you that you have to have a certain constant pressure going down that well. Where does number 5 go? To the garden hose and down the well. As soon as that garden hose opens up, what happens to the pressure that's going down to the well?
Goes down.
And he loses prime. And that's why he's not getting any water out of the new well, because he's not got a constant pressure going down there. Everybody understand that?
Yeah.
I'm going to let you go.